So I asked Murray if there's anything that I shouldn't do this morning, and he said if I got thirsty, I couldn't take a sip from the communion cup, so I brought my own bottle of water. So if there's anything else that goes wrong, it's Murray's fault because he said I could do whatever I wanted to do. Throw Murray under the bus here a little bit this morning. I thought I should probably start with introducing myself because I know I see lots of faces, and I'm like, okay, I recognize this person. I have no idea what their name is. Some are in Sunday school, and I know who they are and know them well, and some I go see at the doctor, and they probably know too much about me. But I'm Andrew Amstutz, so I grew up on the East Coast. We've been in Amarillo for about 5.5 years now, my wife and I, my wife Sarah, and we're house parents at Amarillo Children's Home. And again, some people will be like, where's that? And that's a Presbyterian Home for Children. They're like, so we're at the Presbyterian Home for Children, which is now Amarillo Children's Home there at Bowie and 34th. And so we've been there as house parents for 5.5 years now. But I grew up, I guess I was born in Ohio, and I tell people that by the time I was 4 months old, I convinced my parents to move south of the Mason-Dixon. And they moved to Virginia so my dad could go to grad school at the University of Virginia. And so I spent all my time on the East Coast, and I get up this morning, and I'm like, oh, feels a bit swampy. And I'm like, this feels like home with all the humidity and everything. And so I've loved being here. But my journey here was one that God took me on. In high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had no clue. My brother, by the time he was 15, knew exactly what he wanted to do. And so you hit 17 and get ready to graduate, and you're like, I have no idea. And everybody's like, well, your brother knew. And I'm like, yeah, I don't. So I ended up going to college, majored in building construction. And then God sent me to Northern Virginia, a place I said I'd never go, simply so that when he called me, I'd be willing to say yes. It's the only reason that I ended up there after, didn't realize it till years later, but just so that when God said, I need you to go here, I was willing to go. And about 2 years after I graduated, all of a sudden I ended up the director of youth ministries at our church. December 31st, I was just a youth leader. January 1st, I was running the whole show. And teenagers will very quickly tell you what you don't know. And so I realized I need more education. And so I was deciding how to get more biblical knowledge. And then God used that process to say, actually for you, you're called to occupational ministry. And so immediately I think, okay, that's to preach, that's to be a pastor. And over the years, God said, you know what, there's a lot of different places where you can serve me as an occupation. And eventually that's what brought me from being ordained in the Westland denomination and a youth pastor to leaving that to come and be a house parent. And now I'm here at First Pres, and this year I'm working on trying to transfer my ordination to ECO, to be a part of the ECO denomination. And so I was talking to Howard about that, and he's like, in that case, I'm going to be gone for 2 months. Come and preach. And I'm like, oh, okay, wasn't expecting that fast. And so here I am this morning as we journey through the book of James. I find James to be one of those books that almost is hard to add anything to what James says. He doesn't like give you a parable like Jesus did, but it's almost like those who have the ears to hear can interpret it. James is just kind of like, all right, here it is, don't fight. You're like, okay, got it, what's next? Well, as we go through the book, he talks a lot about the brethren, and he's writing this to his Jewish brothers and sisters, those who are dispersed across the world, and he talks all through about my brethren. And then you hit James chapter 4, verse 13, and he changes his tone a little bit, and he says, come now, you who say. And he does this twice. First there, this is from 2 weeks ago, and those who make plans and say, I am going. I am going to do this. I am going to go make a profit. And James says, wait, are you thinking with a God-first mentality? Is it if God wills, if God allows, if this is what God wants, I will do. And then he starts chapter 5, and we heard this last week about the rich. And the first thought is, oh no, what qualifies as rich? He doesn't give a dollar amount here. He doesn't say if you make $30,000 a year, you're rich, so this applies to you. He doesn't do that, but he's talking about those who are wealthy, who are not living as Christ called them to live. He's talking about those who are withholding wages or who are money-focused first above all else. And then we get to our passage this morning, James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. And he changes back to that, my brethren, my people. There's a little bit more of a commonality or a bond there. These are my kinsmen. This is my extended family. These are my countrymen. We are in this together. So let me read James chapter 5, verse 7 through 12. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door as an example of suffering and patience. Brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so you may not fall under condemnation. Thanks be to God. The first thing that James says here, he uses a phrase, and when I was growing up, I was always taught when you saw the word therefore, your first thought is, what came before that, or what's it here for? Because normally he's referring back and saying, because of this, this is what you should be. And we just read about all the issues with the rich and how they mistreated their employees, or they held back wages, or they were just striving after pleasure. And James is trying to say, hey, considering what you see in the world, this is how you should live as children of God. And he talks about the brethren, and the first thing is, be patient. Now, if you think back to when you were a kid, being patient had a connotation to it that, for me, I didn't enjoy. And I don't know if anybody else, but when you were doing something and your parents would be like, be patient, most of the time that meant sit there, don't move, and don't do anything. But does anybody else have that connotation with be patient? Yeah. It's pretty common. It's like, oh, okay, now I just got to sit here. I got to wait. There's nothing to do. I'm going to be bored, stiff. Nothing's happening. But James doesn't mean to be patient in that way. For him, being patient is an active patience. It's not passive. When you sit back and you look, there's different types of patience. So if I go to the doctor's office and I walk in, I check in, there's never an immediate, I go straight back to a room. It just never happens. And in that patience, you're right, it's a sit. There's not really anything to do. You try to stay as far away from people in case somebody else has COVID beside you, and you're like, ooh, that person just coughed. And so, but I take a book. That's my way to be patient sitting in the doctor's office, is I take a book, and I'll sit there and read. Try to make sure it's a light book if I hop on the scale. That way it doesn't weigh me down too much later. But you carry that with you, and it's just sit, rest, wait, be patient. Well, that's a short-term type patience. But then what James talks about is to be patient, and he references like the farmer. Now, how many of you, I know this is Texas, probably more ranches than farms, but how many people grew up on farms? Okay, a lot of hands. And it talks about that the farmer plants in the spring with the spring rains and then waits for the fall rains and harvests, and that he patiently waits for his crop to produce. But if you grew up on a farm, how many planted and then just sat back and did nothing for the next 6 months and then just went out one day and harvested? Okay, I got to laugh. So, yeah, it doesn't happen. I didn't have a farm, but I had a garden. And it didn't take very long before it was, oh, time to go pull weeds, time to go fertilize, time to, you planted a week too early, so now you got to go out and protect everything from the frost. Or there was always something else to be done. And while we waited for the plant to grow, for it to produce fruit, for that fruit to ripen and be ready to harvest, there was always something to be done. There wasn't just wait, sit back, and do nothing. And so as James talks about to be waiting because of the day of the Lord is at hand, we are to be patiently waiting for Christ's return, for Christ to come back, for us and the promises of God to be realized, and for us to see that fruit and to be able to spend eternity with Him. But in that meantime, God never meant for us to just sit still and do nothing. He wanted us to be active in the faith. That patience is to not try to put things before God, not try to rush His plan. And as I looked through Scripture, I said, where does this show up? It shows up in Abraham. Abraham was God's chosen. God promised him a son, and that through that son, all the generations would be blessed. And he's talking about Isaac. And it goes for years, and Abraham does this. He waits patiently. He keeps doing everything he's supposed to be doing. He raises the sheep. He becomes very wealthy, but there's no fulfillment of that. There's no son. And he got to a point where all of a sudden he realized, well, maybe there's another plan. Maybe I'm supposed to be doing this differently. And he gets ahead of God, he and his wife Sarah, and he takes Sarah's slave, Hagar, and they produce a son, Ishmael. And we see where at that point now there's eternal conflict between Ishmael and Isaac. Where Abraham, he was doing it right. He was waiting, he was patiently, he believed, he didn't lose faith, he knew that God's promise was going to come true. But he got to a place where he's like, this just isn't happening, I got to do something. Gets talked into it by Sarah, however it worked, and he jumps ahead of God's plan. And he stops waiting patiently and tries to do it on his own. And even though he did that, God still said, no. There is a son. My promise still stands to you. And he has Isaac. And then through that family line, the entire world has been blessed because Jesus Christ came for everyone. I got to watch this personally in someone, not quite the biblical sense, but I got to see this in my dad. When my dad was in high school, he was told he would have to have both his hips replaced. So you're talking like a 17, 18-year-old saying, you're going to have your hips replaced. Well, at that point in time, so this is the 70s, a hip replacement might last like 10 years. That'd be good. And from the typical way was once you had 2, maybe 3, you couldn't have any more because that was all they could do. The bones wouldn't take it, whatever. So that means if he would have immediately gone and gotten a hip replacement, by the time he was 40, he wouldn't have been able to do anything else with that. But instead they said, you got to wait. And even though that waiting was tough, to the point where they said, you know what, when you go to bed and you think about pain, when you think about pain all night long, when you think about pain when you get up in the morning, and then you think about pain all day long, then go get your hips replaced. So I remember me and my dad going and playing golf when he's in his 40s and 50s, and I could beat him. Then, about 10 years ago, he had his hips replaced, and I can't beat him anymore. But he waited, and now his life has completely changed in his retirement for a blessing because he was willing to wait. And the reason I talk about that is because sometimes in that waiting, it's not fun. I know my dad had pain all the time in those later years before he got his hips replaced. I remember him talking about it. I remember watching him being able to sit and not be comfortable. I watched him in the middle of summer crank up the heated seats in the car as hot as they would get just because that warmth helped. But there's an aspect of perseverance in there that when he got to the point that it was the right time and the right place, I've watched his life completely change where he can do everything way better than he could 10, 15 years ago. When we wait for the right time, the right place, what God's called us to be, what he's called us to do, it becomes a blessing for us. I don't think there's any doubt in that when we follow God's heart and he says, this is what I want you to be, and we stick to it, there's blessing that comes with that. Even James references Job. And he talks about, we see the patience or the perseverance of Job. And you see Job in the Old Testament, upright, he's righteous, he's wealthy, he's doing everything God's called him to be. And Satan comes around and he's been prowling around the world. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? And then Satan says, the only reason he worships you is because you do good things for him. That's it. Take away the good stuff, and it's all going to be over. And so God allows Satan to take away all those blessings. And it talks about through Job that even through all of this, all the trials and tribulations that Job faced, all his children passed away, his crops were ruined, his animals were pillaged, that he did not sin. And in the end, God blessed him even more than he ever had to begin with. Sometimes in that waiting patiently is not fun. It's hard. It's not just being patient. It's much more in that realm of perseverance, almost a survival of God's testing us through the fire. As we go through it, are we going to be able to remain faithful? Are we going to remain true to what he's called us to be? Are we going to get impatient and say, God, I'm not enjoying this. This isn't working out. And then try to jump ahead of the plan like Abraham did? When God calls us to be patient, and I said he calls us to be actively patient, not just sit and wait. What has God called us to do while we are being patient for his return? There's hundreds of things that we could name. Worshiping together, fellowshipping together, giving to charity, serving, helping out. This week was our service week on our campus. And so our whole campus loads up. And our goal is to teach all the kids we work with that they can be a blessing to other people. And so we go out and we spent 3 mornings at Square Mile with Brady Clark, helping him at his garden and at Murray's house. We went to Faith City Mission, sorted clothes, helped feed lunch, helped them do some paperwork stuff that our kids could do. And we go out and we serve. And in that, sometimes it's just easy to boil things down to the very basics. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbors as yourself. Those two are real easy. And then in Matthew, he says, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. While we're waiting patiently for Christ's return, we should be spreading love wherever we go. Everybody we come in contact with, we should be loving them like we love ourselves. We should have God on the top, showing his love to others, and then telling them about Jesus. This is why we are who we are. I tell you what, the one thing that people notice is when something is not the same. If you go to a Texas football game and you walk in and stand in the middle of the Texas, say, Booster Club, or in the middle of the season ticket holders, and you decide you're going to take off your jacket and reveal that you're wearing a Texas A&M jersey, everybody knows instantly that's different. In our world, as Christians, we should stand out like that. People should see us and be like, they didn't treat that person like everybody else treated them. They didn't handle this situation like everybody else handles them. Because then the people come up and ask questions. Why did you do that? And you have the opportunity to tell them about Jesus. Sometimes people watch for years before they come and ask you that question. But I've had numerous people be like, why do you do this? Why do you care about this? And I say, let me tell you a story. This is why. Because of what Jesus has done for me. So while we're waiting, those are the things that God has called us to be. In that active waiting patiently for his return, for that joyous time when we can be able to celebrate with Christ in eternity. I think of the communion table where Jesus says, the next time that I drink this cup will be with you in eternity. I long for that day. That day excites me. I'm enjoying what I do and living, but how much better can that be? And in James we hear, wait patiently for that day in its time. When Jesus calls us home, it says, come to us. In that time, we need to be about our Father's business. Loving, serving, showing the world who we are and what Christ has done to us. I wanted to, that covers like verses 7 through 11. And James just tucks in this last verse, and the sections of the Bible, we put those in, and so this verse kind of falls in that. But he tucks in verse 12. And we think it says, above all. In our American context, we think this is the most important thing. This is the top, above everything else, most important. Probably not quite what James meant. But James was like, as I read through like some commentaries, because I didn't quite understand where this fell, it's like saying, before I forget, or one last thing, or I want to make sure that I tell you this. And so in verse 12, he says, but above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. So this passage is almost identical to a portion of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, 34 through 37, where Jesus says, let your yes be yes. Don't swear by the temple. Don't swear by heaven. There's one thing that we know about Jesus. It's one thing that we know about Satan. The Bible tells us that Satan is a liar and a thief who's come to seek, kill, and destroy. But the Bible, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth. As we live this life, as we wait in patience, as we live, that truth and integrity and that honesty is going to be one of the biggest ways that we are known by people around us. It's probably the greatest gift my parents ever gave me was a good name. Was that when people heard Amstutz. There's not very many of us. I think we're the only ones in Texas at this point. And at that point, we were the only ones in the state of Virginia. All the Amstutzes are in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They're not in the South. And so in our little town, they heard Amstutz, and people would be like, "Oh, are you Dr. Gene's son? Or do you know?" My dad was never a doctor. They always gave him a raise in title, never a raise in pay. He was a nurse practitioner. But so many people said, "I know your dad. He's awesome. He's done this for me. He's done this." As we go around, when we talk to people, I know our kids say it all the time. Teenagers say it all the time. So many times they'll be like, "This is what happened," and then they're not convinced that you believe them, so they say, "I swear." It's almost like they don't even think about what it is, and it's true, it becomes a habit for us. As Christians, we should be able to say, "I don't know. Let me find out. I'm not sure." But when we say yes, God says, "I want you to do it because I am truth. And I want you to be like me. So be truthful." Because when we get to a point where we go to share the gospel, who Jesus is, what he's done for us, nothing will stand out more than when people know that our yes is yes and our no is no. Because they know we can stand on that integrity and that honesty and that truth. James, there's nothing that James writes in his book that doesn't challenge me to be a better Christian, to follow God closer. For me, there's so much good news in James, even though he's calling us to a higher standard all through the book in our language and how we interact with people. For me, as a Christian, I get the hope and the peace because I see how Abraham messed it all up with trying to have Ishmael. And God said, "You did it wrong, son, but my promises are still true." For us as Christians, we know that even though we may stumble and fall, when we come to prayer confession and bring those things before Christ and say, "Here they are," his promises will always stay true for us as Christians. They will not fail. They're not dependent on us to do it all right. They're dependent on the one who is perfect to stay true, and God always will. So this morning, as we get ready to head into our time of communion and the Lord's Supper, I want you to think as we search ourselves to say, are we ready to come before, to take communion as sons and daughters of the King of Kings in this fellowship? Where are you at? You may sit out here this morning and be like, "I got no idea what you're talking about. This whole thing about always being true, people don't believe me if I don't say, I swear it's true." Or maybe you're like, "I have no idea what it's like to actually feel peace, to wait patiently." Or this day of the Lord, I am scared to death of that. If you don't know that peace and joy that comes from knowing that day of the Lord is going to be a blessing, come talk to one of us. Or this morning, before we take communion, just say, "God, I need you. I need you to show me." For the rest of us, maybe there's a time right now where we can just say, "You know what? God, I haven't been patient. I've tried to rush your process." Or, "God, I've been waiting patiently, but I've been real passive and haven't been active in the kingdom. Help me to see where you'd have me serve, to grow." So just as we prepare, as Murray comes to lead us in communion, just think about those things and say, "All right, God, what would you have me to do? one thing I know about God is he never takes us where we're at and just leaves us there. He always will take us and move us forward to be more like him. Lord, I just thank you for your word. Lord, I thank you for James. I thank you for how he speaks into our hearts and our lives, and Lord, really is very direct. Lord, I just ask that you would speak to us. Lord, your word is for all of us. In this passage in James right now, as I look around this world, the more and more as I see our world walk away from you, the more and more I desire the coming of the King. So, Lord, I would just ask that you would give me patience, give me faith to continually know that you are in control. But, Lord, that I would be active in my patience in waiting for your return, active in serving the kingdom of God and doing the things you've called me to do. Lord, I just thank you and ask these things in your name. Amen.